Ever get that feeling, and something just seems a little, I don't know, off.
Yeah.
Like there's this shiny surface, but underneath it's all complicated.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Oh, that's how a lot of people, I think, are starting to feel about the Olympics.
Hmm. Interesting.
You see the athletes, the medals, all that excitement. But what about what's going on behind the scenes? The business side of it all.
Yeah, when a city gets those Olympic dreams, but then they got to face the reality, right?
Yeah.
The money, the sponsors, all the power the IOC
The
has.
International Olympic Committee. Yeah, that's exactly what we're going to try and unpack today. A lot of you have asked us to take a look at this. So we've got a whole bunch of different voices to consider here.
Oh, this should be good.
We've got research from a former Olympian and academic, and we've even got insights from someone who's actually been a member of the IOC for a long time.
Wow.
And to really get a sense of what we're dealing with here, just think about this for a second.
Mm-hmm.
You know how they always set a budget for the games?
Mm-hmm.
Well, not a single Olympics in modern history
Yeah.
has ever come in under budget.
Seriously. Every single one.
Every single one.
Yeah.
They always go over. And sometimes it's way over.
That's unbelievable. I mean, it really makes you stop and think, like, is all that spectacle, all the fanfare worth it when you see the financial risks?
Right. And that's not all. We're also going to be looking at a situation, get this, a city actually won the bid to host the Olympics. And then they turned around and said, nope, we don't want it.
You're kidding. They just walked away.
They basically said thanks, but no thanks. So, yeah, there's definitely like a whole lot more to this story than you might think.
I'm all ears.
So where do we even begin to unravel this? I mean, how did we get to these billion-dollar budgets and this whole system of corporate sponsorships?
Well, to really understand how it all works, how we got to where we are now, we kind of we got to go back in time.
Oh,
Right.
how far back are we talking?
Back to 1976. That was a real turning point for the Olympics, I think. And it all started with, a city called Denver.
Denver, Colorado, like
Yeah.
the Mile High City.
The one and only. They were actually chosen to host the 1976 Winter Olympics.
Wow.
But then, and this is the crazy part, they decided to say no to the games. They rejected them.
Wait, what? They actually rejected the Olympics. Why would they do that?
Well, it was really the people, the citizens who spoke up. They were worried about what might happen to the environment. They were thinking about the mountains. Colorado's famous for its beautiful mountains. And they were concerned about, too many people coming in, crowding everything, and pollution, and just damaging the natural beauty of the place.
Those are all valid concerns.
Totally. And they actually had this slogan. It was, "Don't Californicate Colorado," which I think, tells you a lot about what they were afraid of.
Don't Californicate Colorado.
Yeah.
Wow, that's really something.
Yeah.
So they were worried about losing, their identity?
Exactly. They were really wary of all the changes that can happen when you host something as huge as the Olympics. The development, the speed of it all.
Right, right. And what's interesting is while all this was happening in Denver, there was another city, Montreal. They were having their own Olympic drama.
Oh, yeah, Montreal. Didn't their mayor say something about, the Olympics never being able to lose money?
That's the one. John Drapeau, he was the mayor back then. He was absolutely convinced that the games would pay for themselves. In fact, he said it was as impossible for the Olympics to have a deficit as it was for a man to have a baby.
Oh, yeah, the famous man having a baby quote.
Famous and wrong. History had other plans. So how bad did it get for Montreal?
Well, their starting budget, they figured it would be around $120 million, give or take. But the final cost, it was more like $1.5 billion.
$0.5 billion. You got to be kidding me.
Nope. And it took them 30 years to pay off all that debt. Can you imagine? A whole generation basically footing the bill for one sporting event.
That's rough.
Yeah.
It's no wonder that cities started thinking twice about hosting the games after that. It's just too big of a risk.
Yeah, I can see why. So what happened? What did the IOC do? I mean, they had to do something, right?
They definitely had to do something. Cities were waking up to the fact that hosting the Olympics could be a financial disaster. And the IOC, they were worried that no one would want to bid anymore. They needed someone who could turn things around, and fast.
Sounds like a tall order.
It was. And that's where Juan Antonio Samaranch comes in.
Samaranch. Now, that's a name that, it comes with some baggage, right?
Yeah, it does. Samaranch's past is, it's complicated. He was a big deal in Franco Spain, so there's definitely, some controversy there.
Right.
But he was also, got to give him credit, he was a brilliant businessman. And when he became president of the IOC, this was in 1980, he was determined to make the Olympics profitable.
Huh.
And let's just say he more than succeeded.
Okay, I'm hooked. How did he do it? What was his, like, secret weapon?
His secret weapon was the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. That's when everything changed.
Los Angeles, how so?
Well, Los Angeles was, get this, they were the only city who actually bid for the 1984 Summer Games.
Really? Wow.
So they had all the leverage. And they basically said to the IOC, okay, we'll host the games, but we're not taking on any of the financial risk.
Hold on, how'd they swing that? I thought the host city always has to cover the costs, if they could go over budget.
You're right. That was, that's in the rule book, the Olympic Charter. It's like rule number 4 or something. But LA, they were in a really unique position. And they were able to negotiate. It was a totally new kind of deal.
Yeah.
And they got the U.S. Olympic Committee to back them up. And then the USOC had to convince the IOC to break their own rules.
Wow. So Los Angeles basically said, no money, no Olympics. That's pretty bold. But if they weren't paying, who was?
Sponsors. They got a ton of sponsors. Corporate sponsors, all the big names. McDonald's, Budweiser, Coca-Cola. Los Angeles really pioneered this whole new way of making the Olympics a big moneymaker. And it worked. Like, it really worked.
So LA created the blueprint for the commercialized Olympics we see today.
Exactly. They were the first to really, I guess you could say, embrace what some people call celebration capitalism,
Right.
Turning the games into this giant, a giant business. And the IOC, well, they were watching. In fact, they ended up creating their own program. It's called the TOP program, the Olympic Partner Program.
Okay.
It's modeled directly after what Los Angeles did. And it's designed to get those long-term global sponsorships. So they have, a steady stream of money coming in. And the LA Games themselves, they actually made a profit. $225 million. It's the first time the Olympics had been in the black since, get this, 1932.
That's a heck of a turnaround.
It is. But, it's not all sunshine and roses. Remember how worried Denver was about being, Californicated? Well, did Los Angeles, did they run into any of those same issues?
Oh, absolutely. While some people definitely benefited, financially, there were communities in LA that ended up feeling left out, even pushed aside by the very event that was supposed to bring the city together.
How so? What happened?
Well, they wanted to make sure everyone was safe during the games, so they had a huge police presence everywhere, especially in communities of color.
Yeah.
And, that created a lot of tension. Some people felt like their neighborhoods were being occupied. It wasn't a good feeling.
So even with the financial gains, there were social costs.
Mm.
And it seems like those costs weren't, evenly distributed.
Exactly. And that tension, the one between all the glamour of the games and the reality on the ground, well, it became kind of a recurring theme. And then there's another big factor that really shaped the Olympics into what we see today: television.
Oh, for sure. I mean, TV, it's how most of us experience the games.
Yeah.
Sitting there watching those incredible athletes.
Right. And that whole, that relationship between the Olympics and TV, it goes way back, like all the way to 1936, the Berlin Olympics.
The Berlin Olympics. Wow.
Yeah. Those were actually the first games to be broadcast on television. But the technology, well, it was pretty basic back then.
I can imagine. So was that when the IOC started making money off of broadcasting rights?
Well, they were definitely starting to see the potential. Even back then, it was clear that TV could, it could shape how people saw things.
Right.
And in the case of the 1936 games, well, it became a tool for propaganda for the Nazi regime.
Propaganda. So even back then, it seems like the Olympics were about more than just sports.
Oh, absolutely. The games have always been connected to politics, ideology, but television, it took that to a whole other level.
Makes sense.
As more and more people got TVs, well, the audience for the Olympics just exploded. By the 1960 games in Rome, the IOC was already making millions of dollars just selling the broadcasting rights.
Millions.
Yeah.
Even back then.
Yeah.
That's wild. I can only imagine how much those rights cost today.
Oh, it's crazy. It's a huge part of their revenue. But getting back to our story, by the time we get to the 1992 Barcelona games, well, the Olympics had become this total television spectacle. Remember that song? Freddie Mercury and Montserrat Caballé.
Barcelona, of course. That was an amazing song. And, speaking of Barcelona, those games, they were a real turning point, I think. I remember watching them on TV. And the city just looked, I don't know, it looked incredible. All those new buildings, the waterfront, everything. It felt like a perfect example of how the Olympics could revitalize a city.
That was the idea, yeah. And Barcelona, I mean, they did do some really positive things. The Barcelona model, that's what they called it. It was all about using the Olympics as a chance to, to really make the city better. And they did. They redid the harbor, they built all these new sports venues, they improved the infrastructure. It was a big deal.
But it sounds like, it wasn't all perfect.
Right. There were criticisms. Some people felt like they were being pushed out, displaced from their homes. And there were concerns about, all the focus being on the touristy areas, not so much on the places where people actually lived. And then there was this, I don't know, this feeling that the city was losing some of its own character, its identity, with all the Olympic stuff everywhere.
So even what seemed like, successful Olympics, like Barcelona, it still had its problems.
Yeah.
So what happened after Barcelona? Did the IOC just, keep riding that wave of success?
Well, the 90s they were definitely a good time for the IOC. They had money, they had power, and cities, well, they were practically begging to host the games. But then came the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta, and things started to, I don't know, they started to change a little bit.
Atlanta.
Yeah.
Really? What happened there? I mean, I remember those games being a pretty big deal.
Oh, they were a big deal, but they were also, well, they were a turning point. There was a lot of criticism. People were protesting about people being forced out of their homes to make way for the Olympics, and about all the security, and about this feeling that the games were mostly benefiting, big companies and wealthy people, and not really helping everyone else. Even Martin Luther King Jr.'s son, he spoke out. He criticized the Olympics for not being fair, for not distributing the benefits evenly.
So the social costs, they were starting to become a lot more obvious, and people weren't afraid to, to say something about it.
Yeah.
Did that have any impact on the IOC?
It's hard to say. They definitely made it through the Atlanta Games, and then they went on to award the 2002 Winter Games to Salt Lake City. But then came another scandal.
Salt Lake City bribery scandal?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that was a big one. If I remember correctly, it was about some IOC members taking bribes, like fancy gifts and favors to vote for certain cities.
Exactly. It was a disaster for the IOC in terms of, their public image. And it really made people start to question, how ethical they were, how transparent they were being. All of a sudden, this organization that seemed, well, untouchable, they were on the defensive.
So did all this, did it finally force the IOC to change their ways to clean up their act?
You'd think so, right? But somehow they just kept going. They awarded the 2016 Summer Games to Rio de Janeiro, and that's where, for a lot of people, things really fell apart.
Rio 2016. What happened there? I remember hearing about some problems. I'd love to get the whole story.
Well, Rio was, in a lot of ways, it was like all the worst parts of hosting the Olympics all rolled into one. We're talking about, overspending, security that was, well, pretty heavy-handed, especially in the favelas, people being forced out of their homes, promises about, cleaning up the environment that never happened. And then, on top of all that, the IOC refused to help Rio with the debt they were left with after the games.
Wow. That's a lot. It sounds like Rio really showed, what can go wrong even when a city has good intentions. Can you maybe explain some of that in more detail? The people being forced out of their homes, that sounds especially awful.
It was a terrible situation. To make room for the Olympics, for the venues, for the infrastructure, Rio ended up evicting something like 77,000 people from their homes.
77,000. That's unbelievable.
It is. Imagine losing your home, your community, your whole sense of place, all for, a 2-week sporting event?
I can't even imagine. Were there any particular stories that really stood out to you in your research?
There were so many, but one that really stuck with me was the story of Heloísa Helena Costa. She was an Afro-Brazilian woman, and she practiced candomblé. And she had this little religious shrine right by her home. When they started evicting people, she fought really hard to stay, not just for herself, but for her community and for the spiritual meaning of that place. But in the end, she and hundreds of other families, they were forced to leave.
It's stories like that, that really show the human cost of these mega events.
Yeah.
What about the promises they made about the environment? Did they at least deliver on those?
Not really. One of the big promises was that they'd clean up Guanabara Bay. That's where they held some of the sailing events. They said they'd treat something like 80% of the sewage that flows into the bay before the games started. but it just didn't happen.
Oh, wow.
By the time the Olympics started, millions of gallons of, well, of untreated sewage were still going into the bay every day.
That's terrible.
It was. It was a total example of greenwashing, saying one thing but doing another.
So we've got overspending, security problems, people being displaced, broken promises about the environment. It's a pretty grim picture.
Yeah.
How did the IOC, how did they respond to all of this? Did they take any responsibility?
Not really. When Rio asked for help, for some financial assistance to cover their debt, the IOC basically said, not our problem.
Really?
Yeah. They said they had already contributed their part and that it was Rio's job to manage the money.
I don't know, that seems pretty cold given everything that happened.
Yeah.
Especially considering that the IOC had just built this lavish new headquarters for themselves in Switzerland.
Yeah, it costs like $147 million.
It does make you wonder. I mean, if the Olympics are so risky, so full of problems, why do cities even bother bidding?
Yeah.
Haven't we learned from what's happened in the past?
That's the big question, isn't it? Why do cities still want to host the Olympics? But to really understand that, I think we need to hear from someone who's been on the inside. Remember Dick Pound, the IOC member, the former Olympian.
Oh, right, Dick Pound, the guy who joked about swimming in the Olympics before they had water?
That's the one. Well, he had a different take on the whole Rio situation.
Okay, I'm curious. What was his perspective?
Well, he said that the IOC, they do learn from each games, that they're always trying to improve things, make sure workers are treated fairly, to reduce corruption, to make the games more sustainable. But he also said that, a lot of the blame falls on the host cities themselves. He said it's, ultimately their responsibility to manage the budget and carry out the plans.
So it's what, like passing the buck? It seems like there's some tension there, between how much power the IOC has and what the cities are actually responsible for.
There's definitely tension. And cities, they often, they get so caught up in wanting to host the games, to be in the spotlight, that they don't always think about the risks. And they end up making promises they can't keep.
I see. So it's not just about, loving sports or the Olympic spirit. It's about prestige, about money, and maybe even, politics. But let's dig into that a little more. Why are they really so eager to host the Olympics?
Yeah.
Even with all the baggage that comes with it.
Well, Jules, the academic, the Olympian we talked about, he thinks it often comes down to, I guess you could say, the elites, the people in charge, the ones with the power, both political and economic. They're the ones who really push for the Olympics.
So it's not really about the average person, the citizens, wanting the games to come to their city.
That's what Jules thinks. He says those elites, they see the Olympics as a way to, to get ahead, to raise their own profiles, maybe even make some money on the side. And he argues that there's never really been a true grassroots movement to bring the Olympics to a city. It's almost always decided, well, from the top down.
It's kind of a cynical view, but it's hard to ignore, some of what we've seen.
Yeah.
So what about Dick Pound? How does he explain this desire to host the games, even with all the potential problems?
Well, Dick, he's a little more idealistic. He talks about how sports can bring people together, how the Olympics bring billions of people together to watch these amazing athletes from all over the world. He sees it as this really powerful social force, this celebration of, what humans can achieve, something that goes beyond borders, beyond politics.
So we've got these two different views, these contrasting perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
One that's, more focused on the not so great stuff, the power plays, the money, the potential for exploitation. And the other one that's more focused on this idea of unity, of inspiration.
Yeah, and I think there's probably some truth to both sides. The reality is probably somewhere in between. But there's another reason why some countries might want to host the Olympics, a reason that's even more, more controversial.
Really? More controversial than billion-dollar budgets and political maneuvering.
Yeah.
I'm all ears.
It's called sports washing.
Sports washing. That's a new one. What's that?
It's when countries that, that maybe don't have the best human rights records or countries with authoritarian regimes, they use these big sporting events like the Olympics to try and make themselves look better on the world stage.
Okay. So it's like using the Olympics to cover up other things that are happening, to create a positive image, even if it's not the whole truth.
Exactly. It's like a distraction, a way to deflect criticism. And Jules, he points to the 2022 Winter Olympics in Beijing as a pretty clear example of this. He says the Chinese government used those games to project this image of, of strength, progress, global leadership, all while continuing to crack down on dissent, on human rights within their own borders.
So it's like the Olympics can be used to legitimize these regimes, to hide their true agendas. That's a disturbing thought.
It is, and it raises some really, really tough questions about what the Olympics are supposed to be, what
Yeah.
their role is in the world today.
It makes you wonder, can we ever really, you know, separate the joy of the games, the inspiration we get from seeing these incredible athletes? Can we separate that from the politics, the money, all the complicated stuff that's going on behind the scenes?
That's the question we all have to wrestle with, I think. As we look ahead to future Olympics, we got to be aware of all these things. We can still appreciate the amazing athletic achievements, the skill, the dedication of these athletes. But we also have to be critical. We got to ask the tough questions. Who's really benefiting from these games? What are the real costs for the host cities, for the Olympic movement itself?
It's a lot to think about. This has been a real eye-opener, this deep dive into the business of the Olympics.
Hmm.
And it's clear that there are no easy answers. It's this global stage where dreams and reality collide, where athletic excellence meets the sometimes harsh realities of politics and economics.
Absolutely. And as you watch future Olympics, keep those things in mind. Ask those tough questions. Can we reconcile the thrill of victory with the costs, the often hidden costs of hosting these mega events? Can the Olympic spirit really rise above all the complexities of the world we live in?
Really important questions. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the business of the Olympics. And as always, we want to hear from you. Share your thoughts, your questions, anything that comes to mind. Join the conversation on social media. Let's keep talking about this.